Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, June 24th, 2023. We begin with our dear ancestor and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati bringing us the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with John Munro, lecturer of U.S. history at the University of Birmingham in Great Britain, and for our purposes today, author of the book, The Anticolonial Front, the African-American Freedom Struggle and Global Decolonization, 1945 to 1960. Professor Munro has some knowledgeable gems for us to connect our freedom struggle here in the belly of the beast of imperialism to that of those worldwide, so be sure to stay tuned. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Professor Andre E. Johnson, Associate Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Tennessee and author of the book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. This book's namesake is a figure that we all should know, and Professor Johnson is going to tell us just why. So stay tuned for yet another informative conversation about a voice that we need today, arguably more than it was needed in the late 1800s. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much content and perspective, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org and pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can become a member for as low as $25 and help Freedom Now stay on the air to bring you this type of quality programming. So hop on that phone line right now and call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, and you'll be able to make your pledge today for $25, $50, maybe even $100 or more to support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure that your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Tumani and Siddiqui Diabate, Noah Haidu, Billy Strayhorn, Ahmad Jamal, Justin Robinson, and the Cora Drass Trio. Now people get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor John Munro.
Maweni Ikai, this is Nidan Kamathi with Freedom Now's weekly African Drumbeat historical calendar with significant dates and events of oppressed peoples and our continued struggle for liberation from racism, class chauvinism, and gender oppression by the oligarchical ruling class of the United States. June 23rd, 1900, Ya Asatwa, an African warrior queen, brings together African kingdoms and a Pan-African anti-imperialist united front to defeat the British colonial forces in the Gold Coast of Ghana. June 23, 1974, the 6th Pan-African Conference is held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, heralding the evolution of the political demands of the peasants and the workers of Africa as central to the struggle against neocolonialism and globalization by the liberation forces. June 23, 2000, Florence Ray Kennedy, an African women liberation leader, made a quotable statement: "If men could get pregnant, abortions would be a sacrament." Flo was a witty, flamboyant activist in the United States. As a teenager, she organized a boycott of Coca-Cola distributors for not hiring African workers. She graduated with honors from Columbia University and was denied admissions to its law school due to her gender. She successfully sued and won and was a legal counsel for Jamil Al-Amin, aka H. Rap Brown, as well as for the New York 21 Black Panthers. She was in the vanguard of fighting for women's rights. June 24th, 1952, Te Puera, a Maori princess of New Zealand, was a cultural and social leader she crosses over. She defined customs by attending New Zealand schools, and with her education, she revived the traditional Maori agricultural, craftsmanship, art, and spirituality, thought long lost in the face of European colonialism and cultural imperialism. June 25th, 1975. Mozambique becomes independent after 12 years of war against the combined forces of the Portuguese, the South African racist government, and the United States and Western Europe. Samora Machel, who was elected president, headed the socialist party called the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. June 25th, 1876, Mary Crawler was reputed to be the only Native American woman who fought at the Little Bighorn in Montana. There, a mighty alliance of the Sioux nations defeated the racist General Custer and his colonial European army forces. June 26, 1919, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League, headed by Marcus Mosiah Garvey, established the Black Star Shipping Line to promote trade and repatriations of Africans in the diaspora to Africa for Africa's liberation and development. June 26, 1975, 2 FBI agents killed during an FBI military assault on the Glagla Sioux Nation by members of the American Indian Movement, Native Americans' Black Panther Party. Leonard Peltier is framed up for the murder and is internationally recognized as a U.S. political prisoner still incarcerated. June 27, 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, a trade union movement, was founded as a response to the sellout of the American Federation of Labor, the big business, and the mafia. The IWW, or the Wobblies, included such heralded figures as Big Bill Hayward, Eugene Debs, Mother Mary Jones, and was the most militant, revolutionary, European, working-class labor movement in the history of the United States. They argued for one big union, undivided by race or class or skill. June 27, 1502, Kaikia Anacona. She was one of the last great governors of the Taino indigenous kingdom in what is now called Puerto Rico. She resisted Spanish conquistadors, inflicting severe casualties. The Spanish military governor, Nicolas de Ovanda, plotted against her and sent 400 troops to capture her. She was eventually taken to Santo Domingo and hanged. June 27, 1977, Djibouti, formerly the French territory of Afar and Esau, a country in the Horn of East Africa, becomes independent from French colonial rule. Djibouti is one of the 5 territories of Somalia that was divided by the Europeans, including the English, Italians, and the French. June 28, 1839, Joseph Cinque led a successful revolt on the slave ship Amistad, one of hundreds of slave revolts on slave ships, on slave plantations, organized around the universal demand for freedom from slavery. June 28, 1964, Malcolm X founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The OAAU was designed to be inclusive of Muslims, Christians, atheists of all religions, as a united front to focus on the common struggle of Africans in America and Africans in the continent into one powerful, united force against racism and colonialism. June 28, 1898, Nehanda, a Shona, which is now today's Zimbabwe, spiritual leader who became a military leader in her people's resistance to British invasion. Her forces were very successful, striking from impenetrable mountain bases. However, the Shona were eventually defeated due to the British mastery of weapons of mass destruction. At that time, the Winchester repeater rifle and Gatling machine guns. 80 years later, Zimbabwe would gain freedom in spite of Western technological superiority over Africans. June 29, 1941, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, was born in Trinidad. Kwame was a leading organizer in the civil rights movement in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a leading organizer in the Black Power movement, as a Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party, and a leading organizer of Pan-Africanism, as a lead organizer in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Kwame Ture was the secretary of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, and member of the Central Committee of the Socialist Party of Guinea. He advanced Pan-Africanism throughout the world. Pan-Africanism is defined as a total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, which, when achieved, will provide a national homeland for black people, African people throughout the world, especially the diaspora. Please join us in a unity chant with the 99% whom over the centuries, as this calendar has just demonstrated, have sacrificed and struggled against a satanic 1%. This chant is in the language of the Zulu people of South Africa, meaning all power belongs to we the people. Repeat 3 times, Amandala Awetu. Amandala
Awetu.
Amandala
Awetu.
Amandala
Awetu.
From KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is John Munro, lecturer in U.S. history at the University of Birmingham in Great Britain, and author of the book, The Anticolonial Front, The African American Freedom Movement and Global Decolonization, 1945 to 1960. Welcome to Freedom Now, Professor John Munro.
Thanks, Professor Horne. Delighted to be here.
And we're delighted to have you. So why did you write this book, The Anticolonial Front?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. I think in many ways it begins with Jack O'Dell, who's someone who I had the honor and pleasure of working with in Vancouver, which is where I grew up and where I did my undergraduate degree. I did some work with Mr. O'Dell, helping to organize his papers or begin the process of organizing his papers, which meant that I would, for a good year and longer, I was going over to his house, him and his partner Jane Power, who of course is also a very important historian and activist, and that led to prolonged conversations about race and racism in the United States, but very much as was always Mr. O'Dell's tendency to put these in an international context. So things about his life and things very much about his analysis led me to write this book ultimately.
And of course, listeners may recall that Jack O'Dell, who passed away a few years ago at the age of 96, for a lengthy period was chairman of the board of Pacifica Radio, which, as you know, includes KPFK. Now, speaking of Jack O'Dell, does he play any specific role in your book other than this ignition process?
Yeah, more than a good term for it. Ignition process is part of it, but it's definitely more than that. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book. Is Penny von Eschen's book, Race Against Empire, had an important influence on me. And I read that book and discussed that book with Jack O'Dell quite a bit. And what was interesting was, to me, was just this sort of contradiction between this idea. I mean, Penny von Eschen's book is hugely important and it needs to be given its due. But one thing that I was struggling with was this kind of argument that McCarthyism ended Black radicalism in the 1950s. And here talking to Jack O'Dell was just such an obvious counterpoint to that because of the ways that he survived that period of deep reaction and then went on to have an influence in things like Pacifica Radio, obviously, his work with Jesse Jackson, and the peace movement in the 1980s. There's many ways in which his influence was a very long-standing. So that was kind of an entry point, but also an ongoing one in terms of thinking about that dynamic, which is really central to the book, arguing that that an anti-colonial Black radical internationalism persisted through this period despite the very real repressions of anti-communism and McCarthyism.
So it persisted through the period up to 1960 or beyond?
And beyond, exactly. So I periodized it there because I feel like the 1960s is the beginning of a new kind of era and maybe a better known era of the kinds of internationalisms of the Black Panther Party, for instance. And so I wanted to try to chart a bit of an earlier history to see where the origins of some of that Black radical internationalism not just comes from, but was continuing through a moment, really kind of joining those moments of radicalism of the 30s through into the 1960s. So that's the period I'm particularly concerned with, but the broader implications are that there is a longer kind of tradition here that goes into the 60s and certainly beyond.
Now, who was Claudia Jones and what role does she play in your book?
Yeah, great. So she plays an important role as an activist, a theorist, and an intellectual, and also someone who really demonstrates the kind of argument that I wanted to make about both the very real repressions of anti-communism, but also a kind of persistent opposition in the face of them. So Claudia Jones, originally from Trinidad and lives in the United States, as many of your listeners will know, member of the Communist Party and one of the most important theorists, writing really important articles in the journal Political Affairs on what we now might call intersectionality, thinking about race, class, and gender together through a kind of materialist and communist critique of racial capitalism. So she's deported in the 1950s. She goes to the UK, but then she begins the carnival there, and she also goes on to have an influence on left and communist circles in Britain as well. And so her organizing and her journalism through the West Indian Gazette continues in the UK. So both her deportation, which was very difficult, obviously, for her. She didn't want to leave the United States. It wasn't at her choosing. Is one example of the kind of repression side of McCarthyism, but then her ongoing activism shows that there is an ongoing history there that goes into in her case, until she dies in the mid-1960s.
So she also is quite active in London during that particular period.
That's
and
right.
I'm wondering, does she still maintain any sort of connections, transatlantic connections with folks back in the United States during that time?
Yeah, she's reading and contributes to the conversation around the kind of Freedom Ways circle in the United States. There's a little bit of correspondence with I think it might be William Patterson. Like, there's definitely some ongoing connections, but exactly, her center of gravity does move to the British context. But I also think that in her own correspondence with comrades in the UK also kind of indicate not just the literal connections transatlantic with activists in the United States, but also that kind of sensibility that she was developing and shaping in the US really impact her thinking in relation to the British left, who, from her point of view, is have a very undeveloped idea about the relationship between racism and imperialism and capitalism. And so she also brings that sensibility from the US, which is very ongoing in her work and conversations in the UK as well.
Now, speaking of a sensibility that links racism, imperialism, and capitalism, what about the Council on African Affairs, started not least by the late, great Paul Robeson in the 1930s, the premier organization in the United States spearheading the struggle against apartheid and colonialism? What role specifically do they play in your pages?
Yeah, they play an important role exactly for the reasons you just outlined. They are a central organization for, and again, they play an organizational role in pulling together some of these ideas and thinking about these connections between racial capitalism, imperialism on the global stage, but also very much the ways that those are forces that the Black community in the United States is also struggling against in the fight against Jim Crow and racial segregation. So they play an important role in that sense. They also, and of course, Alpheus Hunton is one of the key theorists there as well. And it connects to Paul Robeson's paper, Freedom. There's kind of a journalistic and organizational, whole kind of robust anti-colonial kind of front, I call it, but just a kind of world, really. Of course, by the mid-1950s, that just becomes very difficult because of the committees, the attacks on Black radicals. Of course, Paul Robeson's passport is taken away, and his career is so directly attacked. I mean, it's kind of interesting, Dr. Horne, talking to you. You know so much about this yourself, obviously, more than I do. But this is what I'm thinking about in terms of the ways that the Council on African Affairs plays this hugely important organizational role. They're able to organize events and connect to publications and so on. But a point I also want to make is once that organizational structure is no longer able to continue because of the reactionary attacks on it, the individuals in that organization are still able to go on to Alpheus Hunton Wright's Decision in Africa, for example. There are ways that influence kind of continues, even though the structural apparatus of a really important organization like the Council on African Affairs is not able to survive the 1950s.
Now, many in our audience know that Algeria in North Africa creates or opens or hosts a legation, a diplomatic mission for the Black Panther Party by the late 1960s. What role does Algeria in North Africa play in your book?
Algeria doesn't play a huge role, but it's an area of ongoing importance. And you're absolutely right. By the mid to late 1960s, there's a lot of eyes on Algeria, definitely, Mecca of Revolution, as it's sometimes called. But I would also say that the story with Algeria is one that we should trace back to the very beginnings of the post-war moment. In fact, actually, I would date them to May 8th, 1945, the very day on which the Nazis surrender in Europe, Victory in Europe Day, is the day that Algerians in Sétif begin to demand independence. And so the struggle against imperialism begins, is quite symbolic, on the very day that World War II officially ends in Europe. So the Algerians themselves, I think, are quite central to the story, and there's ongoing organizing that's happening. The international left, even in France, takes a little bit longer to sort of come to terms with what's happening. But exactly by the 1960s, after the beginnings of more and more countries becoming independent across the African continent, then this leads just more and more attention to to Algeria, which becomes a kind of center of international radical activism and thought in the 1960s.
And of course, Ghana in West Africa, under the leadership of the late great Kwame Nkrumah, surges to independence by 1957. It opens its doors to many Black Americans, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois and a host of others. What role does Ghana play in your book?
It plays a huge role, exactly for the reasons that you've pointed to. And because of the direct connection between Kwame Nkrumah and W.E.B. Du Bois. They're both in Manchester in 1945. They maintain an ongoing kind of correspondence, and of course, as you and many of your listeners will know, that W.E.B. Du Bois's papers and correspondence are voluminous and a great source for historians. They're also a really useful way to track the ongoing kind of sets of connections that persist even after McCarthyism wrecks, some of that institutional organizational apparatus of the left in the mid-1950s. And Du Bois and Nkrumah's correspondence would be an example of this. And then, of course, famously, Du Bois relocates to Ghana, where he dies in 1963. So Ghana becomes, between 57 and 66, becomes this absolutely central place of a staging ground upon which, the fight against imperialism at a global level can really be waged and potentially be won. Of course, the CIA plays a role in what happens in 66 to kind of to curtail and to some degree, snuff out those dreams. But in that very important initial period of almost a decade, there's a lot of kind of hopefulness attached to Ghana. Martin Luther King goes himself to witness the independence celebrations as well. So kind of for Black radicals, and Black communities more broadly, and other anti-imperialist kind of forces of many kinds, Ghana is a real beacon after 1957.
So you mentioned in your previous remark the overthrow of the Nkrumah government in 1966. Apparently, the CIA, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, had their fingerprints on the coup. At that time, the U.S. ambassador in Ghana was a former NAACP official who had roots in California, speaking of the Black American Franklin Williams. And I'm wondering, as this activism is unfolding on a global level, how are the U.S. authorities responding? How are U.S. corporate interests responding? How is the CIA responding?
Yeah, in a number, I guess as we would expect, in a number of ways, kind of coups and hard power, as well as soft power attempts to sort of co-opt some of the activism as well. Definitely the coups are a crucial part of this, but I think too, Mary Helen Washington's work on the kind of literary scene in the United States also shows that there's ways that the CIA was attempting to fund literary organizations and and sometimes that had kind of unexpected outcomes as well. And so the influence is there, and it's pernicious. That's definitely the case. But there's also kind of unexpected ways in which activists were able to, again, sort of persist through this period despite the very negative impact of the CIA. And of course, they're very interested to make sure, no doubt, because Ghana was such an important example of possibility and what might be different. And of course, Nkrumah's non-alignment and the way that he maintained relations with the Soviet Union are part of this as well, that this made this all the more a kind of dangerous example that Washington would be indeed worried about. Richard Nixon goes as well to witness, as vice president, to witness the independence celebrations. But of course, they're also wanting to keep an eye on it, to keep Ghana, if possible, in the Western fold. But if not, other options are available. And exactly, fingerprints on the coup, I think, are one way of thinking about where this goes.
Finally, John Munro, lecturer in U.S. history at University of Birmingham in Great Britain, author of the book The Anticolonial Front, The African American Freedom Movement and Global Decolonization, 1945 to 1960. What next for your loyal readers? What can we expect?
Thanks for this question. I'm working on a project called the Imperialism Syllabus, which I'm working on with a colleague and friend, Radhika Natarajan at Reed College. And it was with Public Books, and it's an online kind of resource that people who are interested in histories of imperialism more broadly and in anti-imperialism can make use of. And we're at the beginning stages of turning that into a book. We're not quite sure how that's going to look as a book, but we're hoping that it's going to be a resource for historians, scholars, activists, and others.
So you're suggesting that part of this is online as we speak?
Yes, exactly. On the Public Books website, it's called the Imperialism Syllabus. So there's an online version, and the book version is forthcoming. That's what we're now working on.
Do you recall the URL of the Public Books site?
I don't, but if your readers Google simply Imperialism Syllabus, Public Books, that will definitely bring them there.
Great. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Munro, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
What a delight to speak with you. Thanks, Professor Horne.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Professor Munro for sharing his hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show by donating today. And you'll be able to get one of our awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. Dr. Horne, tell the people about what they can take home today.
Have you ever wondered why white supremacy is so endemic in North America? Have you ever wondered how and why North America not only wound up with so many enslaved Africans on these shores, but how and why it perpetrated genocide against the indigenous while looting Mexico? Have you ever wondered why and how so many Europeans wound up in North America and spearheaded an economic system, capitalism, that disproportionately benefits those settlers? All the while shouting from the rooftops that this is the greatest nation in the history of the world. Well, wonder no longer. We at Freedom Now have got you covered. For a mere $100, receive a signed copy of the book by Gerald Horne, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Read this book and understand the role of religion, especially Protestants versus Catholics and Christians versus Jewish and Muslims versus Christians in this entire process, and understand the religious roots of white supremacy itself, suggesting why it is so hard to get rid of. Read this book and understand the role of Africans and the indigenous in resisting helping to shape the contours of this nation. So pick up the phone and dial
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735.
But wait, there's more. Pledge $100 and get a new book by Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Understand how and why the capital of white supremacy, the capital of this empire, has intermittently had a black majority in its capital, leading to its nickname Chocolate City. Understand the role of Marcus Garvey's movement, the Communist Party, the Nation of Islam, unions, the Red Scare, and the Black Scare in shaping both Washington and national politics. Understand how the independence of Nigeria and Jamaica and the sovereignty of Ethiopia led directly to an erosion of U.S. apartheid, that is to say, U.S. Jim Crow. Understand how Black Washington has fought back against gentrification. Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of Revolting Capital. But wait, there's still more. Pledge $180 and receive both books, The Dawning of the Apocalypse and The Revolting Capital, both for a mere $180, signifying your support for Freedom Now and the radical and revolutionary programming that we deliver every week.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. And folks, there you have it. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, we are going to keep this train moving and send you back off to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by Professor Andre E. Johnson, right here on Freedom Now.
From KPFK in Los Angeles, Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Professor Andre E. Johnson, Associate Professor of Communications Studies at the University of Memphis in Tennessee, and author of the book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Johnson.
Well, thank you, Professor Horne, for having me, and it is indeed a pleasure to be with you today.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book? And by the way, who was Bishop Turner?
Wow. Bishop Turner was the 12th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal, or the AME Church, one of the four horsemen of the church. Very influential figure during his lifetime. He was born February the 1st, 1834. He died May 8th, 1915. Over 60 plus years in the public arena, preaching, teaching, of course, serving as a bishop, the first Black chaplain in the armed forces here in the United States, state legislator, just a whole host of firsts for Bishop Turner. And when I discovered a speech, the September 3rd, 1868 speech, where he and 31 others, African-American representatives, were kicked out of the legislature in Georgia, I ran across this speech, and I, Brother Horne, said, who is this person, this brother speaking like this in 1868? It just sounded like a prophet, one of those Old Testament prophets. Woe unto you, And when I began to do the research and began to look, especially in the field of communication and rhetorical studies, it just wasn't a whole lot on him. And I began to unearth his writings, speeches, letters to the editor, and began to really see that this was a forgotten figure. So thus, my first book on Bishop Turner, The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry McNeal Turner in the African American Prophetic Tradition, I just wanted to reintroduce to a lot of people this person who was so instrumental during his lifetime. And then the follow-up book, and it should be read as a sequel to The Forgotten Prophet, No Future in This Country. I wanted to just focus on the last 20 years of his life, 1895 to 1915, and attach with that the stuff that was going on here in America, in which Turner's voice was just prominent in all of that. So the first book is just a reintroduction, goes up to 1895, and the second book is a follow-up sequel. And if you read both of them together, you have a nice, comprehensive, at least an understanding, a rhetorical understanding of the importance of Bishop Turner.
Now, you mentioned prophetic pessimism, which I think it refers to the title of your book, No Future in This Country. I assume that he's suggesting that people of African descent have no future in the United States of America.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that and elaborate on the concept of prophetic pessimism?
Sure. Right in the late 1890s or mid 1890s, really, Turner began publicly to say the Negro has no future in this country. And it was basing it on the history up until that point and what was going on at the present time. After Reconstruction, and after Reconstruction, the white backlash was strong. It was all over. It was total. And no matter what African Americans did, no matter how much they tried to separate, tried to stay out of white folk way, tried to do whatever they were doing on their side of town, they just could not seem to build as they would like, or to even catch a break on a daily basis, just getting a job. These things begin to be problematic. Chain gangs and imprisonment and the lynchings that were going on unabated. So Turner, at the end of his life, becomes an immigrationalist. And he thought going back to Africa or going to Africa would solve a lot of the problems. But he even began to understand that there was no real movement with that. And so he becomes, what I argue in the book, this pessimistic prophet. And what I mean by prophetic pessimism is not a nihilism. It's not a defeatist attitude. It is understanding that things that we are propagating and promoting and wanting to happen and saying that they were, and you got to understand this with the backdrop of African-American rhetoric during the late 19th century, that we're coming out of slavery. We got all of this now. There's no more excuses. We can do whatever we want to do. Turner was totally against that. Turner is like, well, you're not living in the real world. We cannot do this. We still have these issues and problems. And Turner's prophetic pessimism was grounded in an understanding that nothing that he wishes was going to change today or tomorrow, but he had to bear witness to it. And so when people were talking about, for instance, hey, look at all these schools that we're building, or look at the doctors that we are making and all of these professionals, Turner would gently remind people about the lynching that just happened, or the lynchings that continue to happen, or the continued arrests and incarceration of Black people, which now becomes the prison industrial complex. And at the turn of the century, how African Americans were still being ostracized and segregated within this country. So his prophetic pessimism was not a hopeful optimism that something was going to happen anytime soon, but he did not give up. He doesn't go to Africa. He did not go to Canada. He does not move up north. He stays right there with the people that he claimed to represent, who saw him as a voice for the voiceless, to use an old turn of phrase, and began to help people understand that, hey, this is not all in my mind, that there is somebody speaking out for me. And that's what I mean by prophetic pessimism. He's speaking truth to power, bearing witness, knowing that nothing is going to change, but not quitting, not giving up.
So what was the meaning of this concept, God is a Negro? And what is the possible connection to Black theology?
Right. James Cone said in many of his writings and lectures that when he ran across that phrase, it helped him begin to develop what we now understand as Black liberation theology. But Turner, and it's very interesting how Turner used it in 1895 when he appears at the First National Baptist Convention. He gives the keynote address and he mentions that. And what Turner is arguing for is that for Black people to not understand that the divine looks like you, that's going to be problematic. If you are a person of faith and you believe that the God of all creation is against you because of your Blackness, then that's going to be a problem, because you're praying to a God that doesn't care about you. But if you pray to a white God, you also are praying to a God who doesn't care about you, a God that allows you to be enslaved, a God that allows you to be whipped, a God that allows you to go through all of the indignities that you go through. So Turner is trying to get people to understand that you and all of your beauty, and this has a lot to do with how Black people thought of themselves in the late 19th century. A lot of them were using lightning cream. A lot of them were, if they could, they were passing for white. A lot of them hated their features, hated how they looked. And Turner is totally against any of that. And he begins to understand that for a lot of Black people, especially ones that were Christians or ones that will consider themselves religious, he began to understand that it is the nature of God, God's self, that begins to be a problem. So he begins to understand that if I am going to worship a God, that God got to look like me. That God has to sound like me. That God must like me and like my features enough to make me the way that this God made me. And God is a Negro is an affirmation of not only faith, but also an affirmation of the humanness of Black people, that God's self looks like, acts like, feels like, is seen as Black, and comes out of Blackness. He begins to develop what we will now term a Black liberation theology, talking about God coming out of Blackness, that the only thing that the only way that we know whiteness is out of, or birth out of, Blackness. So Turner becomes one of the first, I should say, religious people and theologians to begin to really tackle that and begin to understand that if a people do not believe that God is on their side, then there's really, and this is his own quotation, there's really no hope for a group of people who don't believe that.
So why did he oppose the United States war against Spain in the late 1890s that leads to the United States grabbing the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, amongst other territories?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, Turner was he led the effort to get Black soldiers involved and Black people involved in the Civil War. Of course, back then in the 1863 to 1865, he believed that this was a war of freedom and that it was a reason for Black people to fight. By 1898, he was like, there's no reason. Why would you want to put your life on the line to go over? And he was saying this in articles. Why would you want to put your life on line going over to other countries and fighting people who closely look like you or align with you and how you are treated in this country? He thought it was a war of imperialism, and he thought it was a war of just America doing what America does, conquest. And he did not think that Black people should have a dog, to use a proverbial phrase, a dog in that fight. He thought that Black people were already ostracized and beat up enough here. And it's really reminiscent of what we hear, what Turner is saying in 1898. It's really reminiscent of what we start to hear in the 60s with the war in Vietnam, and how, people were saying Black people should not be fighting this war in Vietnam because you go over and fight a war there. World War I, World War II, same thing. And when you come back home, you're not even respected back home. And Turner just thought it was just asinine, really asinine for Black people to fight that war and to be a part of that, and thought that the United States was not fighting a, quote, holy war or a war of justice at all. They just wanted to gobble up territory, which, we can look back on it and say maybe Turner had a point.
So what was his connection to Southern Africa?
He made 4 trips to Africa. His last trip, 1898, I believe, he goes to South Africa, and by all accounts have a wonderful time there. But one of the things that he did was to plant the seed of the AME Church, and then the people there began to reinterpret their understanding of church and Blackness, and becomes this movement in and of itself. The bishop that he ordained a couple of years earlier left the AME Church to be a part of the church that was growing in South Africa and in other parts of Africa as well, that had a liberationist bent towards it. And so Turner is looked upon even today favorably as the person who planted the seed of what Black liberation theology can look like, what a liberationist God could look like and act like, and how people could find hope and power right in that moment. And so Turner is one of the if there was any veneration of sainthood, Turner probably would be one of the people that they would mention in their history, because Turner was very, very important what Turner did while he was there, the short time that he was there, and the teaching and the preaching that he shared with them.
Finally, Professor Johnson of the University of Memphis, author of the book No Future in This Country, what is the Henry McNeal Turner Project, and what's next on your research agenda?
That's a great question. The Henry McNeal Turner Project is a digital humanities project that's actually getting ready to be restructured and reorganized. What I am attempting to do is to collect all of the writings, letters, op-eds, whatever I can find from Turner, and to put it into this one digital humanities project, and just put it up online so people can feel free to read and to discover Turner for themselves. I just completed a book of Turner's speeches, his extant speeches. I teach African American rhetoric and public address oratory. So the speeches are important to me. The speeches of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner, the press, the platform, and the pulpit, where the speeches that we have, the whole speeches that we have intact, we try to collect them. They just came out about 3.5 months ago with the University of Mississippi Press. And what's next on the agenda is probably another, probably a bio or a spiritual bio, or maybe even I may work on his writings in the Voice of Missions newspaper. We may do that one first and then do the spiritual biographical treatment. But the ongoing project with the Henry McNeal Turner Project is an ongoing one. Hopefully later this fall, you'll see a new website, new revamped, more interactive, more easier to search and easier to access. And that's what we're working on right now. So somebody told me, Brother Horne, when I first began to work on Turner, they told me, this about 15 years ago now, they said, you'll be working on Turner probably for the rest of your career. And you know what? I'm still working on Turner. So they were right.
I see. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor.
All right.
Of the University of Memphis, author of the book, No Future in This Country. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Pacifica, Andre E. Johnson.
Thank you.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor John Munro from the University of Birmingham in Great Britain. Find that Black-owned bookstore you know and love and get his book, The Anticolonial Front, The African American Freedom Struggle and Global Decolonization, 1945 to 1960. We'd also like to thank Professor Andre Johnson representing the University of Tennessee. While in that bookstore that you love, why not grab his book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati for bringing us the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers and the station needs your help to pay the bills and keep the lights on and the mics hot in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.